Hello, welcome to Making Creativity Pay. My name's Dan Barnett, and this podcast is about talking to those in the creative industries about the business and promotional side of their work. In this episode, I'll be talking to James Cridland, editor of Pod News, a podcast and newsletter about the world of podcasting. What James doesn't know about podcasting isn't worth knowing, and there's loads of details on James's various areas of work in the show notes. I spoke to James about the various possibilities of making money from podcasting, such as ads, subscriptions and sponsorship, through to more advanced methods such as microtransactions and value for value. We also discussed the future of podcasting and the potential impact of podcasting 2.0. We started the episode by talking about the concept of sustainable creativity.
So the aim of the podcast, kind of people I'm speaking to, it's all about your sustainable creativity. I'm going to use that everywhere now. I think that's a nice way of putting it. So it's not the kind of, I can make you a millionaire in 30 days kind of nonsense.
The first time that I heard the phrase sustainable creativity, it was a guy called Ronsley Vaz, who runs a marketing agency, but also does podcasting here in Australia. And I loved the thought, because the thought around sustainable creativity is covering your costs while you are doing something creative. So at least covering your costs. You can do far more than that if you work really, really hard. But if you're, for example, paying your hosting company $20 a month, perhaps you bought some equipment as well, can you earn that back? Can you make sure that the creativity that you are doing, which is valuable in its own right, but can you make sure that that is at least not costing you money, but is instead generating enough money to cover its costs? So I really liked the idea of sustainable creativity. There's another podcast guru called Todd Cochran that runs a podcast company, and he talks a lot about how a podcast, it might start up with paying back the hosting company that you're using, which is about $20 a month. Then perhaps you might move up to paying off, buying a nice dinner for you and your family once a month using your podcast, or perhaps paying for the car or paying for the mortgage. It isn't necessarily a quick rush to having a job and quitting that job and starting everything up as being a podcaster. That doesn't necessarily work. But I think certainly using little steps like this is really helpful.
If someone was about to start a podcast, they were reasonably, it doesn't have to be like mega famous or anything, but had a reasonably decent sized following, so it wouldn't just be in the tens of listeners. It'd be hopefully in the thousands and something like that. Where would you kind of say for them to go first, in terms of doing something with that from a monetization point of view?
I mean, I think that there's lots of different methods of monetization. And you say that you need a large audience. You need a sizable audience of the right type of people. And that doesn't necessarily mean a massively large audience, particularly when you're looking at something like sponsorship. Sponsorship, you'll typically use your own contacts for this sort of thing. You will call companies, you'll do the hard graft of cold calling companies that you think has a good connection with the podcast that you put together. So, for example, if you're doing a podcast about knitting underwater, then you probably want to ring the people that make the very special wool that you use, which is water resistant wool. They would be really interested in sponsoring a podcast which is about underwater knitting, even though you may only have 50 or 100 people listening to it, because they're 50 or 100 of the right people. Yeah. And that's the important thing here, I think. You can have a look at volume, and there are ways of earning money through just pure volume of people, tuning into your podcast every single week. But there's also a very important part around niche audiences and reaching particular audiences that are valuable to certain people. So sponsorship is a good start. Obviously, once you've got the volume, then you can start having a look at the sorts of things that you might have heard through Acast, for example, where they will sell adverts within your show, and the only thing that you have to do is to mark where those adverts come. But and those are fine, but they're relatively cheap, and you need quite a lot of volume to do that. So, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 listens per month is a good sort of starting point for that sort of thing. And then there's a variety of other ways as well that you can have a look into. But most people will start with either thinking about ads or thinking about a sponsorship for their show.
And I mean, it's the great kind of mystery of the last 20 years of the internet is the kind of monetization, microtransactions, all that kind of stuff. People have been trying to crack in all different ways, whether that's the value for value, Lightning Network, or whether that's Twitter coming out with their coins now, Facebook stars. It seems as if guess, key thing is if you're trying to process an order for 20 cents or whatever, then it's probably going to cost 50 cents to process that. And so it seems like most of the web monetization things that are coming up now, it's, well, you put $10 to them and then they move the numbers around and they kind of divvy it up at the end of the month effectively. It's kind of how it works. Do you see anything kind of breaking through in that?
So I mean, value for value by itself is most certainly breaking through. I mean, the numbers that we are seeing at the moment of podcasters who are using value for value is pretty impressive. It's over 11,000 different shows now, and the theory behind value for value is exactly that sort of micropayment thing. It certainly doesn't work particularly when you have a look at, for example, streaming micropayments. So maybe you want to pay the podcast that you listen to, maybe you want to pay them 2 pence a minute, or that sort of tiny small amount. Now you can't do that in terms of the standard Visa card, MasterCard, American Express thing, because it doesn't work that way. So you do need a separate way of doing it. And there have been companies trying to fix that in the past. And what they were trying to do essentially was to, as you say, take, $5 maybe or $10 a month of your money and share that around with the podcasts that you listened to. Which was a nice idea. It cut the amount of payment costs, but it was still not very ideal, because you couldn't turn around to a particular podcast and say, actually, I really enjoy you and I would like to pay you more because I get an awful lot of value out of you. So those sorts of tools have existed, but value for value, which is part of Adam Curry and Dave Jones's podcast 2.0, is really interesting in that it is a voluntary, unlimited and direct payment to the podcasters that you really like. It uses Bitcoin under the hood, but you needn't worry about that. Instead, it's just a way of rewarding the podcasts that you listen to for the value that you get for those particular shows in a way that is up to the listener and completely voluntary as to how much they actually want to give.
I know you said, don't worry too much about Bitcoin, but I guess people will, there's a group of people, completely on board. There's probably some people who are interested but nervous, and some who would run in the opposite direction of anything crypto. Do you think there's a way of kind of getting over that hesitancy or that reluctance to, touch it with a barge pole?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty with the whole crypto conversation is that actually this isn't crypto. This isn't, it happens to use crypto under the hood, or happens to use Bitcoin, which some people will tell you isn't crypto. But anyway, happens to use that sort of technology under the hood, but it's completely irrelevant for the conversation that we're having. So if you remember going to the fairground, and you would go to the front desk of the fairground and you would buy some tokens. You buy your fairground tokens, and it avoids wandering around the fairground with lots of real money, and instead you end up being given, £10 worth of tokens, and away you go. Nobody's talking about that being an investment. It's just an easier, simpler way of buying some money, in inverted commas, for you to then go around the fairground and have goes on the rides that you want to have a go at. And in much the same way, what's happening with streaming sats or Bitcoin or all of that kind of stuff, it's just you are putting some money into a wallet that you can then share with your podcaster, the people that you listen to in terms of a podcast. And the fact that it's been changed into Bitcoin, or a very small amount of Bitcoin, is kind of neither here nor there. It's not an investment. It's just a different way of paying those individual people. I completely get why people are scared of investing in Bitcoin. This really isn't it. And this is just purely a method of getting those micropayments through in a way where MasterCard and Visa don't run away with the first 30 pence of every single bit of money that you've actually sent anybody. From that point of view, I completely get the worry, but actually it's kind of got nothing to do with it in this particular case.
I think, from my personal point of view as a user, so I use Fountain, so that was a great way to kind of get sats without having to put any money in. In the UK, for example, I think MoonPay is one of the easiest ways, but you've got to give your passport to a company that's selling NFTs to Paris Hilton. And you kind of think, I don't really want to give my passport to those guys. I'm not completely sure. You kind of think, yeah, Fountain's a great way to kind of get on. But there's that kind of thing. If I've got $50, how do I get it in the first place without having to jump through know your customer hoops and all that kind of stuff.
I think Fountain over the last week or so has made a number of changes to make life simple and straightforward in terms of that. So I think it's become an awful lot easier. The difficulty, of course, with all of this is that it is a bank account. It might only have 50 quid in it, but it's still a bank account. So therefore you do need, unfortunately, to go through some of the scanning your driving license and all this kind of stuff. But that's unfortunately going to be the way of it for now. But I think the difference there is that you're not investing here. You're not putting money. You're not putting a large amount of money into a wallet that you hope will go up, and then at some point you'll change back into dollars or sterling or whatever it is. It's really just a mechanism for you to end up paying directly to the podcaster that you really enjoy. The benefit of the Lightning Network, which is the network that deals with all of the payments, is that it's almost cost-free, which means that if you are, for example, giving your podcast app, 5 pence a minute to listen to your favorite show, then they are getting pretty well all of that 5 pence. They're not all of a sudden being asked to pay another 25p by Visa. So there's real benefits on the other side. It's just, you have to convert your fiat money, as they call it, into Fairground tokens first, prior to actually paying somebody. But it's it's an interesting way of doing it. I was working out in terms of, we talked about ads, we talked about sponsorship. Typically, you'll look at those in terms of a cost per thousand, is the way that you work out how much money you're earning from advertising. If you look at typical cost per thousands for podcasts, it's around the $20 cost per thousand mark, which means that every 1,000 ads that you sell, you earn $20 worth of money on that. If you work out the amount of money that you actually get from something like value for value, from streaming sats and from asking people as well, which we haven't gone on to yet, then it ends up being about that. It ends up being about $20, $25 cost per thousand. So it's actually a very good alternative to taking advertising. And of course, the benefit is that you don't necessarily have to be awfully careful about what you say about a sponsor or about an advertiser. That's always a benefit too.
Do you think sometimes people oversell the need for there to be a quid pro quo? So, one example is a podcast I follow. They have a Patreon. It's like a couple of quid a month, but with that, you get an extra episode every week. And, look on Patreon, they've got like 30 something patrons. So they're getting about £15 a week, and they're having to do a half-hour podcast. So that's a lot of work and a lot of extra hassle. Whereas if they more said, pay us £2 a month and we'll drop something extra in now and again when we feel like, I doubt that they would have many fewer patrons, but they'd have a lot less hassle and a lot less kind of.
I would completely agree. I think the difference here is that Patreon is, you end up choosing, from, it might be $5 a month, it might be $10 a month, there may be a couple of tiers in that. What happens if I want to give $500 a month? Because I really like what that creator does. I can't. There's nothing there for me to enable that. So I think the benefit of something which is voluntary and unlimited, where you can pay what you think something is worth rather than what the creator thinks it's worth, is actually quite beneficial here, because you don't end up having to choose from a particular tier. When I launched the Pod News newsletter, which I write, which comes out every single day, the first method of funding for that was Patreon. And I thought to myself, okay, can I manage to, what can I do that actually doesn't mean that I'm doing any extra work? I want people to support what I do, but I don't want to end up creating something which is a lot of extra work, which is therefore going to take my time away from the core product. And so, frankly, if you were, I think for the first 5 years, if you were a personal supporter of the Pod News newsletter, and personal means paying less than $150 a month, so there are quite a lot of those, you got nothing in return other than knowing that you were supporting this thing that you read. And I had an awful lot of personal supporters and still do. So I think that's an important side, that you don't necessarily have to give stuff back. Patreon is deliberately built to give stuff back. There's another similar website called Buy Me a Coffee, which is pretty obvious that no, you don't get things back. You're here to support a particular podcast, and that's as far as you go. or support a particular creative endeavor, and that's as far as you go. So I don't necessarily think that you do have to necessarily give people stuff back that isn't just the value that they're already getting. And you can be paid in time, talent, or treasure. Treasure might be lots of money, but also people might want to do things for you. People might want to promote your show in other ways that you haven't thought about, or produce new artwork for you, or redo your website, or all of that kind of stuff. That is valuable as well. It might not be valuable in terms of a monetary number, but it's still incredibly valuable.
In terms of the kind of, going on a more traditional, in inverted commas, relatively speaking, compared to Lightning Network and stuff. Yeah. So, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. I was listening to your weekly one, and you were kind of a bit dismissive of Google in that they haven't developed much, and the same for Apple. Do you think the big players have kind of taken podcasts for granted, or it's just not a big enough deal for them?
I mean, I think both Spotify and Apple are spending a lot of time at the moment investing into their podcast platform and making sure that it will do certain things for them. Apple has seen a real change, I think, in attitude now that they are selling a subscription service. So if you're a fan of the Daily Pod News newsletter, for example, or the Daily Pod News podcast, then you can get an ad-free version of the Daily Pod News podcast through Apple. And you pay a certain amount of money, and Tim Cook gets 30% of that, but I get the remaining 70% of that. And so all of a sudden, I suspect that what Apple have seen there is, right, we're now making money for the company. This is a good thing. Now we can actually fight for a bit more engineering resource. We can fight for a bit more promotional resource. They've only had their own PR team for a couple of years. They never used to have a PR team. They never used to talk to any of us. So I think that there's a good sort of movement in terms of Apple. And I think also, Spotify is certainly spending an awful lot of money. I think Spotify's difficulty is that they don't see themselves as part of an ecosystem. And I think that that's a mistake. I think if they were there working on standards, working on ensuring that their podcast platform was the best podcast platform that is possible to have, but they were going to use all of these standards that have been already generated by the podcast community, I think that they would be having a much better time of it than they currently are with having to rebuild everything. But, certainly Apple and Spotify are promoting podcasting an awful lot now. And I think that that's beneficial to the rest of us. About 30% of us don't use Apple or Spotify. So there's a large amount of people who do. But I think it's a beneficial thing for all of us to have some really big players who are pushing podcasting and pushing the type of content that you can get through that.
They're introducing the concept of paying for podcasts into the conversation. So even if you don't do it through those channels, the whole idea of podcasts are worth paying for.
Yeah. And I think, I grew up in the UK. The UK doesn't have a history of supporting the media that they listen to, partially because you kind of have to in the UK by law pay your TV license fee because otherwise you get thrown into prison. If you look at the American market, it's very different. Your local NPR station will every so often go on this ridiculous funding drive for a week, desperately asking you for lots of money so that they can continue broadcasting for a further year, and giving you tote bags and all kinds of things if you give them a certain amount of cash. And the same goes for the TV services as well. PBS will do much the same sort of thing in terms of TV. It's much more ingrained into US culture, is the idea that you actually give to the media that you enjoy consuming. And that's something that isn't necessarily done in the UK. It's done far less, here in Australia where I'm talking to you from. So I think, there's a bunch of those different cultural things there. But at the end of the day, I think that people understand that quality creative content needs to be paid for in some way. And either that's through annoying adverts that you hear that are promoting all kinds of things to you, which always will make a slight difference to the creative content that you also hear, or that's a different way. And that might be sponsorship, might be subscriptions, it might be streaming sats, it might be all of those sorts of things. But I think that people are beginning to understand now that it's not just flinging ads onto something. There are a lot of different other ways of doing that too.
I mean, one of the previous episodes was with a comedian, and part of his background was in street performing. So he was very comfortable, both in that sense and in the podcasting, to kind of do your job and then ask for money. Whereas, the normal British way would be, I couldn't possibly. You do that thing and
yes.
You would hope someone out of the goodness of their heart would suddenly throw money at you. You wouldn't dream of asking for it. And yes, I think that's generally, like I said, with kind of producing extra content, you almost feel as if you have to kind of totally go out of your way to justify the money rather than saying, the core product, this is good. I hope you enjoy it. It costs me time and money to make it. And
I think that then lends itself far more to the idea of value for value. The idea of asking people, if you get value out of what I do, I would really appreciate some value from you back. You don't have to, the way of cutting that down is by talking about tips or talking about donations. If you're giving a tip, that's a £2 coin in a jar somewhere. If you're giving somebody, if you're buying a book, it's far more than £2. So in the same way, I think we need to be careful how we do this. If we talk about tips, if we talk about donations, then we're already pointing people towards a very sort of small number of what they might want to give. Whereas if you leave it far more open, then you do get far more back. So I just think we need to be careful in terms of doing that. One of the things that the new podcast apps like Fountain are doing very successfully is that they're monetizing comments that you give back to a podcast. So if you want to get a message back to the people who are making your favorite podcast, then you can send them what's known as a boostergram. And that essentially means that you get some additional, that the podcaster gets some additional money as well as a message. And the podcaster might end up reading that out. And there are real benefits in terms of that because, podcasting is a very lonely thing. You don't necessarily see all of your listeners all of the time. So actually hearing from them every single week is amazing. The fact that they're paying you money is also amazing too.
And in terms of, if someone was starting out, wanted to produce a podcast, do you think the market is ready yet for some of the more advanced features? So, chapters, transcripts, and transcripts shouldn't necessarily be considered advanced. But, when you look at kind of the main charts, it's still a rarity. Do you think that there's value for users in those kind of things like chapters, chapter art, the transcripts, those kind of added value?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think the way of creating some great... so firstly, you need to focus on the great content that you create, right? You need to make sure that the podcast itself is really, really good. If you're just starting out, put all of your energy into the podcast. But you should also consider, once you're up and running, and you can do this once you're up and running, that's absolutely fine. You should also consider augmenting that experience with, make sure you have a website. That's the number one thing. So that you've got somewhere to link to. Make sure that you are doing transcripts partially so that you're accessible to people that can't necessarily listen to your show, but also so that you're accessible to things like Google and to other people that might want to search through what you've ended up saying. And then, the icing on the cake, the decorations of making sure that you've got nice chapter points so that people can skip through your particular show if you want, if they want to, making sure that there's, pretty artwork if you want to do that sort of thing. All of that stuff is really good augmentation, I think, on the top of your creative work. But, focus on the audio first and foremost is what I would say if you're starting out. There's no doubt that additional features and the additional features that are coming out from Podcasting 2.0, but are also coming out from a variety of other things. Those additional features will certainly make podcasting more interesting to other people who aren't perhaps tuning into a podcast right now. And are more used to things like YouTube and Instagram and that sort of thing. How do we make audio a little bit more sexy? Well, one of the ways is to actually make it chapterizable, to add some images in there, to make it a little bit more shareable and searchable. And that's what a lot of these new tools are being built to end up doing.
Do you think it's going to need a reasonably big podcast to kind of properly take a punt on those kind of things to drive it mainstream?
I think there's a couple of things. I think firstly, yes, of course, creators need to be producing this stuff in order that podcast apps get it into the podcast app. And, that's the important thing. When will Apple and Spotify support transcripts? I mean, there are plenty of disability laws telling them that they have to be supporting that right now, but when will they actually support transcripts? That seems to me like a really easy, low-hanging answer in terms of what people should be focusing on now. I completely understand that once you start talking about payments through your podcast app, then you've got all kinds of legal issues and all kinds of other things that you need to focus on. But actually just starting at the bare minimum of getting transcripts in there, making sure that chapters are supported by your podcast app is a really important thing. Spotify is supporting chapters, but in a different way to the standard, which is always the way. Apple is supporting chapters, but you probably wouldn't know it because it's so hidden in the user experience that it's almost impossible to end up finding. So if they were capable of putting those a little bit more in front of the audience, then I think that would be really helpful.
I remember it's probably like a year or two ago now, but one of the podcast hosts, kind of searching which ones do chapters, which don't. And I think they said no one uses chapters. And, there's always that kind of thing, everyone asks me, we do chapters, but no, there's no call for chapters, that kind of thing, they build it and they will come. So, if the hosts kind of build all this kind of stuff, but if no one's using it, then what's the point? And so someone's got to make the first move on that.
Exactly. It's the whole chicken and egg thing of in this particular case, you need 3 sets of people doing stuff that nobody is currently using. So you need 3 sets of people. You need the creators to be creating the content. So if you look at chapters specifically, for example, you need creators to be creating content that they are chapterizing. You need podcast hosts to either not mess about with the chapter points or to give you a beautiful user experience to edit those particular chapter points. And there are different things that are being done out there. Some podcast hosts rip all of the chapter points out of your audio as soon as you upload it. Brilliant. Well done. Other podcast hosts will muck about with them, but will give you at least a user interface that you can actually edit those with. So you need the podcast hosts to support it, and then you need the podcast apps to end up supporting it as well. And I think the podcast apps is less of a problem, if only because I think we are beginning to see now a bit of a rise. It's a slow rise, but a bit of a rise in terms of non-Apple and Spotify downloads and listens. We are beginning to see people who they've played around with something like Fountain or Podverse or one of these new podcast apps with some of these new features in, and they've understood, actually, there's more to podcasting. There are more features in here. There are more interesting things here. And even if they don't use those full time, at least they understand that those features actually exist now, which is a helpful thing. So that sort of side of it as well. But at the end of the day, all 3 of us, all 3 of those sets of people need to be convinced that it's worthwhile working on this. But I think, certainly over the last 2 years, because the whole new podcast namespace hasn't been going for the last 2 years. So I think, over the last 2 years, we've actually seen quite a lot of take up already. And my suspicion is that we will see more take up of some of the new podcast namespace. And it might be the boring ones, in inverted commas, boring ones like transcripts. Might not be the exciting ones like streaming sats, but I suspect that we will see those being put into some of the much larger podcast apps in future.
Podcasting as a medium, where do you think in the next 2 to 5 years podcasting will go?
I think if you look at for example, the US or the UK, I think that we will see a slowdown in the growth of podcasting, if only because podcasting is becoming so mainstream in those countries. There are very few people left who don't understand what a podcast is. They might not listen to them, but there are very few people left who don't understand what one is. A fair few people who haven't listened to one ever. So we're beginning to be at a point where the US and the UK it's not reaching capacity by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly I think we'll see growth begin to slow down, but it's still growth, let's not forget. But what we will see is we'll see the rest of the world catching up as well. If you look at the amount of podcast news and information that's been coming out of Germany over the last couple of years, a country which has been, historically quite slow to catch on to podcasts, you can see that there's definitely something happening in Germany. There's a lot of things happening in Central Europe around podcasting, and there's a large amount of growth that could happen there. And then, of course, you've got all of Asia, where podcasting is really getting going. Now, it's Spotify's world in Asia. That's where the majority of the audience is, and that may or may not be a problem as we move forward. But there's the amount of growth, the amount of population in Southeast Asia is so massive anyway that I think we'll see an awful lot of growth there, and of course, Africa and other parts of the world to come as well. So I think it'll be an uneven growth as we move forward, but I think that there's tremendous opportunity, particularly if you are capable of podcasting in a language other than English. There's an awful lot of English language podcasts.
Yes.
But actually, the most podcasting languages that are growing the most aren't English now, and they haven't been English for a number of years. They're languages like Hindi and Malay and, all of those sorts of languages where there haven't necessarily been as many podcasts in the past. So I think great opportunity there for all of that kind of thing. As well, what we'll probably see this year is a continued growth of the independent podcast app. So apps that aren't Apple or Spotify. I mean, Google is so small, it's not even worthwhile mentioning on this, but certainly Apple or Spotify. I think we'll see an awful lot of growth of other apps, and I think that's good for the industry as well. And we can't escape the fact that we are clearly heading into a recession, even if it's not officially one yet. Advertising is the first thing to go in a recession. So I suspect that there will be a bit of belt tightening over the next couple of years. But I think that podcasting, just by its very nature of being, if you want it to be quite cheap to produce, will actually enable some really good creative to come out over the next couple of years. And I think that will be good for the industry too.
Talk about foreign languages. I know you did one in Spanish, so it's kind of synthetic voice.
Ah, yes, this is the good folk at sounds profitable. I think AI is interesting because so what this podcast was essentially my voice, but what my voice was doing is it was actually speaking in Spanish. I don't speak a word of Spanish. I was speaking in Spanish from a AI generated translation, so I could essentially make a podcast in Spanish. Now, I think this is a nice technical toy. Whether or not this is something that is the future of the industry, I'm not so sure. But is it part of it? Yes, quite possibly. I think that there are certain things there where you can just produce something a little bit different. There are AI voices are being used all over the place. And in fact, if you listened to one of a recent podcast that I did, right in the intro, I got the month wrong. And so when I was editing it together, I thought, I've got the month wrong. I'm going to have to go back and record, get into the right frame of mind so that my voice doesn't sound too different, go back and record me saying that the new month or blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, no, I don't have to. I've got an AI version of my voice, which I can just type in, November instead of October or whatever it was. And if you're using an AI version of your voice to make a little correction, like one or two words, you simply cannot hear it. It's absolutely perfect. So it's great for that sort of thing. Perhaps not so great for producing a 30-minute podcast in a different language.
No, absolutely.
But I'm sure that those kinds of things are coming.
Yeah, I was having to play around with Speechify. I don't know if you've seen it. And one of their voices is Gwyneth Paltrow and another one is Snoop Dogg. So you can put text in and it will say to Snoop Dogg. So, there's those kind of things where even with like a few seconds, it's getting faster and faster and better and better. Even with a few seconds of someone's speech, then you can kind of use that for any kind of pattern. And like you said, well, why not make it Spanish or Mandarin or whatever it would be?
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of possibilities. It's probably slightly straying from the main topic, but there's a lot that can be done there.
But there are there's a number of different things. I always wonder, given the size of the Spanish language community out there, what would Pod News in Spanish? How would that work? And I think my answer is it wouldn't just be, and in the same way, in terms of a podcast, the answer is I don't think it's just running something through Google Translate. I think it's actually making sure that what you're covering in this new version is relevant to the audience. I think it's so you're actually changing what the editorial is. I think you also need to make sure that you aren't necessarily using any terms or phrases which are very very, US centric or very Australian or whatever that might be, so that it is more open. And at the end of the day, these are all different cultures as well. And so I think it's a mistake just to assume that in order to make a great show in German, for example, you just translate the English into German. German people are different to English people, particularly different US people, US folk to Germans. Therefore, you kind of do need to change the content that you're actually creating. So I think, as a lot of podcasters are finding, it's not necessarily just as easy just to run everything through Google, Translate. It's actually a case of taking a concept and putting it into the right cultural frame for that audience.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to James for coming on the podcast. There's links to James's podcast, website, and a number of areas discussed in the episode in the show notes. If you enjoyed this, check out the back catalogue for previous podcasts talking to people in a range of creative industries about making creativity pay.